I put this wig in my head, it's over. If I put this wig in my head, it's over.
It began like any ordinary morning in Jackson, Mississippi. A quiet Sunday, the kind where most people are still wrapped in sleep, unaware of the heartbreak about to unfold just a few doors down. But inside one home on Brook Hollow Drive, a conversation spiraled into chaos, a tragic eruption that would leave a family broken forever. At the center of this heartbreaking moment were Rashawn Wallace, a 30-year-old licensed practical nurse, and her husband, Damian Reed, 33. They weren't celebrities or household names, just a couple living a life that looked a lot like yours or mine. But on February 23rd, 2025, their private world collided with something unthinkable, and nothing would ever be the same. According to police, the argument started over something many of us might consider trivial, a social media friend request. But for Rashawn and Damian, this simple digital notification became a flashpoint. Words turned into accusations. Tension escalated. And within minutes, a moment of fear turned deadly. Rashawn later told authorities that Damian had accessed her account and confronted her over the message. She claimed the confrontation became aggressive. In a state of fear, she retrieved a firearm. She said she first fired a warning shot, a plea for space, not harm. But when he kept coming, she fired again. This time, the bullet struck her husband. When officers arrived at the home around 11:30 a.m., they found Damian mortally wounded. Rashawn, reportedly distraught, had already begun performing CPR and had placed the emergency call herself. But despite her efforts, Damian was pronounced dead at the scene. A father, husband, and man with life ahead of him. Gone in an instant, their child, present in the home, was unharmed physically. But the emotional weight of witnessing such violence is something no child should carry. And for Rashawn, the nurse who spent her days saving lives, the unimaginable had happened. She was now under arrest, accused of taking the very life she once vowed to protect. The community was stunned. Neighbors expressed disbelief, describing the couple as quiet, normal, loving. There had been no signs, no shouting matches, no police calls in the past. That morning shook them all, because if something like this could happen here, it could happen anywhere. Rashawn was taken into custody and charged with murder. She made her first court appearance days later, where the judge granted a $50,000 bond. Her defense team quickly began preparing a case centered around self-defense. According to them, this wasn't a crime. It was a survival response during a moment of panic. As the case made headlines, it sparked urgent questions. Was this a domestic dispute gone too far? Was it truly self-defense? Or was it something far more complicated? Emotional, relational, human? No matter the legal outcome, one truth remains: a life was lost, and another was forever changed. This is the story of Rashawn Wallace and Damian Reed. A tragedy born in the blink of an eye, over something as fleeting as a digital friend request, but rooted in layers we may never fully understand. And as we tell this story, we invite you to listen with empathy, not just judgment, because behind every headline is a heart. Behind every statistic is a soul. Before the flashing lights and headlines, before the courtroom appearances and grief-stricken statements, there was simply Rashawn and Damian, two people trying to build a life together. Their story didn't begin in tragedy. It began with love, with hope, with the kind of quiet commitment that so many couples make every day. They were a husband and wife navigating the ordinary joys and challenges of life in Jackson, Mississippi. Rashawn Wallace, 30 years old, was a licensed practical nurse. She had worked hard to earn her credentials and build a career in healthcare, a profession that demands not only skill, but compassion, patience, and resilience. Her days were long, often spent tending to the sick and elderly, managing medications, and offering calm reassurance in places filled with pain. She was, by all accounts, dependable and caring. Damian Reed, 33, was known as someone steady and present. He was a father, a partner, and someone who brought his own sense of order to their household. Though less is publicly known about his work or daily life, those who knew him described him as devoted to his family and proud of the life he and Rashawn were building together. Together, they lived on Brook Hollow Drive, in a quiet Jackson neighborhood marked by trees, modest homes, and neighbors who nodded hello on their way to work. It was the kind of place where people felt safe. a place where children rode bikes, and couples made plans for the weekend. For Rashawn and Damien, it was home, a space that held both their routines and their dreams. They weren't without challenges, of course. Like most couples, they had disagreements. They navigated the stresses that come with long work hours, bills, parenting, and digital distractions. But they kept going. They showed up for one another. They celebrated holidays. They cooked dinner. They raised their child. From the outside, it was a picture of normalcy. But relationships are layered. Sometimes what looks peaceful on the outside carries unspoken tension within. Whether it was growing emotional distance, mounting frustration, or unhealed wounds from earlier arguments, we may never fully understand what pressures were building beneath the surface. Still, what's clear is that nothing about their story suggested this kind of ending. Family and friends were blindsided. No history of violence, no documented abuse, no police reports of domestic disturbance. That's what made the events of February 23rd even more jarring. It wasn't the culmination of a long, visible descent. It was a sudden explosion in a place where no one expected it. Social media, for all its trivial posts and silly distractions, can sometimes reveal unspoken hurts. The argument that allegedly sparked that day's violence was rooted in something as modern and fleeting as a friend request. But the emotional weight behind that digital moment was clearly heavier. What may have seemed small in action became monumental in meaning. As more details surfaced, friends began to wonder if they missed something. A passing comment, a look, a sign. That's often the cruel hindsight of tragedy. People search their memories for what could have been a clue. But Rashawn and Damien weren't loud or public about their struggles. If they had any, they kept those moments private, as so many couples do. In the end, we're left with a story that began like countless others, with connection, with family, with shared plans. And while the world now knows their names because of one horrific moment, it's important to remember that there was life before that moment. Rashawn and Damien were more than the headlines. They were human, real, complex, and deserving of being remembered in full. Like many modern relationships, Rashawn and Damien's story was shaped by both love and life's many responsibilities. Their connection began in the quiet ways so many do, conversations that turn into companionship, shared goals that slowly shaped a shared life. It wasn't dramatic or flashy. It was the kind of relationship that builds through the everyday moments. Cooking dinner together after work, discussing bills, putting their child to bed, and figuring things out one day at a time. They had built a home together, not just in the physical sense, but emotionally too. There was a rhythm to their relationship, a partnership rooted in mutual dependence. Rashawn, with her demanding job as a nurse, often carried the weight of emotional exhaustion from her shifts. Damien, as a father and partner, brought his own strength to the household. They leaned on each other, filling in the gaps when life stretched them thin. But beneath that partnership may have been layers of complexity, tension, and misunderstanding that rarely reached the surface. From the outside, everything appeared typical. Two people balancing work, parenting, and marriage. Yet every relationship has private corners, unspoken moments, and conversations that never make it to the dinner table. Sometimes, the quietest relationships carry the deepest internal struggles. Friends and neighbors didn't notice anything alarming. No shouting to the walls, no police presence, no visible signs of conflict. But that doesn't always mean peace. Emotional distance can grow silently. Resentment can form through small, repeated dismissals. A single misunderstanding can fester when left unspoken. And when neither partner knows how to bridge the silence, the gap widens without warning. Their relationship was also part of the digital age. Like many couples today, social media became both a connection and a source of tension. Likes, messages, and friend requests might seem harmless, but in vulnerable moments, they can become symbols of trust or betrayal. The very argument that led to tragedy stemmed from a friend request. Something so small on the surface, but emotionally charged in the heat of a strained moment. Whether the jealousy that sparked the confrontation was new or long-standing remains unclear. What we do know is that Rashawn felt threatened enough to retrieve a weapon. That decision, the result of fear, impulse, or both, changed everything in a matter of seconds. But what led up to that moment was likely a complex history of emotional buildup that the outside world may never fully grasp. Their relationship was real, layered, and like so many others, imperfect but meaningful. It had love, responsibility, stress, joy, and silence. It held two people trying to make it work, in a world that often leaves very little space for vulnerability or emotional healing. And while we'll never know every detail of what existed between them, we can hold space for the truth that relationships are rarely just one thing. They are as multifaceted as the people within them. It was a quiet Sunday morning, February 23rd, 2025, on Brook Hollow Drive in Jackson, Mississippi. The kind of morning where the world still feels hushed, where families are just beginning to stir, and where nothing seems out of place. But inside one home, what started as an ordinary day turned swiftly into tragedy. That day would become the dividing line between what was and what would never be again. Rashawn Wallace and Damian Reed were at home with their child. No one knows exactly how the conversation began, but it quickly escalated. According to Rashawn's statement, the argument started over something many couples fight about, a friend request on social media. What might seem trivial to some can carry emotional weight, especially if there's underlying insecurity, distrust, or a buildup of unresolved tension. Rashawn claimed that Damian had accessed her social media account and confronted her about the friend request. The conversation, already emotionally charged, became heated. She later told investigators that Damian's demeanor became threatening, that she felt cornered, scared. Fearing for her safety, she retrieved a firearm kept inside the home. It was a moment of decision made under emotional pressure. She said she fired a warning shot, not to hurt, but to create space, to stop whatever she believed was coming. But according to her, Damian didn't stop. In the next breath, she fired again. The second shot hit Damian. In a matter of seconds, the man she had shared her life with was mortally wounded, and the foundation of her world had collapsed. Rashawn's reaction was immediate and instinctive. She dialed 911 herself and began performing CPR, trying desperately to revive the man she had just shot. It was a moment full of contradictions. Fear and love, survival and regret, action and consequence. The dispatcher stayed on the line as Rashawn pleaded for help, her voice shaking, the weight of what had just occurred setting in with crushing speed. When police arrived, they found Damian unresponsive. Despite Rashawn's efforts, he was pronounced dead at the scene. Their child, physically unharmed but likely forever changed, was present in the home. The quiet Sunday morning had ended in heartbreak. One life was lost, and another would never be the same. Outside, neighbors looked on in disbelief as squad cars and emergency vehicles lined the street. It didn't make sense. There had been no history of public conflict, no warning signs that something like this could happen. But as is often the case, the worst moments don't always arrive with notice. They come suddenly, shattering everything in their path. That day became a painful marker for a family, a neighborhood, and a community that never saw it coming. When officers from the Jackson Police Department arrived on the scene that February morning, they were met with a haunting scene. Rashawn Wallace kneeling over her husband's lifeless body, hands trembling from both adrenaline and disbelief. The woman who had dedicated her life to healing others was now facing the devastating reality of having taken a life. It was a moment filled with pain, confusion, and silence that said more than any words ever could. The responding officers immediately secured the home, removing the child to safety and preserving the scene for forensic analysis. As investigators began piecing together what had happened, they noted the position of the body, the firearm, and signs of a struggle or lack thereof. Every detail mattered now. Every angle of the story needed to be cross-checked, not just to find out what happened, but to understand why. Rashawn was fully cooperative with authorities. She gave her account of the incident willingly and without hesitation. According to her, she acted out of fear, not malice. She emphasized that she fired a warning shot first, hoping to de-escalate the situation, but when Damian continued advancing, she felt she had no choice. It was a moment she wished she could take back, but one she believed was necessary in that split second. Investigators took her statement seriously, but they also had a job to do. Forensics examined the shell casings, the trajectory of the bullets, and the firearm. The 911 call was analyzed, her tone of voice scrutinized. Rashawn's emotional state during the call, pleading, panicked, trying to save Damien, painted a picture that was anything but cold-blooded. Still, a man was dead, and charges had to be considered. The case was soon classified as a domestic homicide, and Rashawn was arrested on suspicion of murder. She was taken into custody and booked, a mugshot capturing her blank stare, the expression of someone who had not yet fully processed the magnitude of what had happened. For those who knew her, it was almost unthinkable to see Rashawn in that setting. She wasn't a criminal in their eyes. She was a mother, a nurse, a neighbor. The community reacted with shock and sorrow. Neighbors who had seen Rashawn and Damien on quiet walks or family errands couldn't reconcile the news with what they thought they knew. This didn't feel like a story of evil. It felt like a story of emotion gone unchecked, of love twisted by fear, of a tragic misfire in every sense of the word. Shortly after her arrest, Rashawn made her initial court appearance, where she was formally charged with murder. The judge reviewed the facts presented and set her bond at $50,000, a relatively low amount for such a serious charge, perhaps reflecting the unique circumstances of the case and her lack of criminal history. Her legal team began preparing for a self-defense claim, citing fear and emotional distress as the key factors in her actions. Law enforcement continued their investigation, reaching out to friends, family, and co-workers to learn more about the couple's dynamic. Had there been previous signs of conflict? Did Rashawn ever mention feeling unsafe or overwhelmed? Every story added a layer to the narrative. Some painted a picture of quiet tension. Others expressed nothing but confusion. Digital evidence became a focal point. Investigators examined the social media messages, the friend requests in question, and any previous online interactions that might explain the emotional stakes of that morning's argument. What seemed like a minor dispute now carried immense weight. It had, after all, been the spark that led to loss. By the end of the first week, the police had a clearer timeline, but not necessarily a clearer motive. This wasn't a crime driven by greed or jealousy in the usual sense. It was an emotionally charged moment that spiraled beyond control. Rashawn's case, now in the hands of the courts, will become not just about guilt or innocence, but about fear, instinct, and the unforgiving weight of one irreversible decision. As the legal system began to take hold of Rashawn Wallace's case, the emotional weight of what had happened continued to ripple outward, through her family, through the courtroom, and through the public still reeling from the tragedy. Though she had no prior criminal history and was known for her gentle, compassionate demeanor as a nurse, Rashawn now stood at the center of a homicide case. It was a position she never could have imagined, and one that came with unimaginable pressure. Rashawn appeared in court for her initial arraignment, where she was formally charged with murder. But even that charge, heavy as it was, didn't seem to fit neatly into the reality of what had occurred. This wasn't a case marked by premeditation or malice. It was a case marked by emotion, fear, and an argument that escalated in seconds. Her defense attorney immediately signaled the intent to argue self-defense, and many began to wonder if justice in this case would look different than usual. The judge granted Rashawn bond at $50,000, allowing her to be released while awaiting trial. This decision sparked quiet conversations in the community and online. Some saw it as fair, given her background and cooperation with police. Others questioned whether more information was needed. But for Rashawn, it meant returning home, without Damien, and facing the haunting silence of what she had lost. In the weeks that followed, the legal proceedings slowly unfolded. Her defense team began collecting evidence. The 911 call, expert testimony, and details about her emotional and psychological state at the time of the incident. They prepared to argue that Rashawn genuinely feared for her life, that her response, however tragic, was not an act of cruelty but one of desperation. Meanwhile, the prosecution worked to establish whether Rashawn's actions constituted murder under Mississippi law. They would need to prove that her fear was not reasonable, or that she used force beyond what the situation warranted. That's the tightrope of a self-defense claim. It doesn't just require fear. It requires justified fear in the eyes of the law. And often, that judgment lies not in hard facts, but in the hearts and minds of a jury. Court proceedings were expected to be slow, as both sides gathered testimony, reviewed forensic evidence, and dug into digital communications that might offer insight into the couple's emotional landscape. The friend request, the simple trigger that began the argument, would likely become a key part of the trial, symbolizing the undercurrents of mistrust or pain that had been building beneath the surface. As the court dates approached, the community watched with quiet anticipation, not for a spectacle, but for closure. Because in cases like this, where tragedy touches people who were never meant to be in the spotlight, justice doesn't feel like punishment. It feels like understanding. And for Rashawn, who carried both the weight of her actions and the pain of her loss, the courtroom became not just a place of judgment, but one of reckoning, with the law, with grief, and with herself. The loss of Damian Reed sent ripples through his family and community, ripples that could be felt not just in the silence of his absence, but in the questions left behind. He was more than the victim in a tragic case. He was a father, a husband, a friend. Those who knew him spoke of a man who had a calming presence, someone who showed up for those he cared about and worked hard to provide for his family. His loved ones have had to walk the painful path of grieving not only his death, but the circumstances around it. There was no time to prepare, no illness to soften the blow, just a sudden, violent end to a life that had been full of potential. For Damian's family, especially, the pain is twofold. Mourning a beloved son and try to understand how someone he lived with and loved could be involved in his death. In the days that followed the shooting, candlelight vigils were held by neighbors and community members. Some came to honor Damian's memory, others to offer silent support for Rashawn and her child. And some came simply because the tragedy felt too close to home. It reminded everyone that domestic situations, even ones that seem peaceful from the outside, can turn in a heartbeat. The most heartbreaking layer to the story lies in the life of their child, who now must navigate a world changed forever. That child not only lost a father, but saw their mother taken away in handcuffs. They are too young to carry such grief, too innocent to understand what truly happened, and yet they will grow up in the shadow of it. One day, they'll have to make sense of both parents' choices and their love in the broader community. The case sparked quiet reflection. Conversations about mental health, conflict resolution, and the dangers of escalation began to surface more often. Local leaders and organizations called for more support systems for couples and families in emotional crisis, especially those who may not show outward signs of struggle but are battling inner tensions behind closed doors. At Rashawn's workplace, the news was received with disbelief and sorrow. Colleagues who knew her as a warm, dedicated nurse were shaken. Many expressed their sadness for Damian's death, but also voiced compassion for Rashawn, recognizing that she was not a monster, but a person who had broken under pressure. It was difficult to reconcile the caregiver with the woman, at the center of a homicide investigation. Meanwhile, friends of Damian shared stories online, photos from birthdays, quiet moments at cookouts, and proud posts of him holding his child. They reminded the world that Damian's life mattered deeply. He wasn't defined by how he died, but by how he lived, with loyalty, humility, and love for his family. His memory now lives in those stories, and in the people he left behind. Supporters of Rashawn also spoke out, urging others not to rush to judgment. Many believed she acted in fear, not out of violence, and that the situation was more complicated than it appeared. Some called for greater awareness of how unresolved emotional strain and miscommunication in relationships can spiral dangerously without support or intervention. It's in these echoes of sorrow, of remembrance, of questions, that the true impact of this tragedy is felt. Beyond the legal system and courtroom debates, there is real human loss here. A family torn apart, a child growing up without two loving parents, friends still reeling from unanswered questions, a community trying to learn how to prevent the next tragedy before it happens. In the end, what happened in that home wasn't just about one moment. It was about everything that led to it and everything that followed. And for those left to carry the weight of it all, healing will be slow. But in the remembering, in the telling of their story, there's a hope that maybe others can be spared the same pain. The tragedy between Rashawn Wallace and Damian Reed wasn't just an isolated incident. It is part of a much larger conversation about domestic relationships, fear, and the deadly consequences of firearms inside homes already heavy with emotional tension. Across the country, too many families have experienced the same pattern, a heated moment a split-second decision, and a life that can never be brought back. Domestic disputes don't always look like the headlines portray them. They don't always involve repeated abuse, bruises, or screaming matches. Sometimes they're quiet. They're made of eye rolls, cold silences, mistrust, and buried resentment. And without support or communication tools, that quiet can become dangerous. In Rashawn and Damien's case, there's no clear evidence of past violence. But there was tension, there was fear, and there was a weapon. The presence of a firearm in the home changes everything. Studies have shown that having a gun in a domestic setting significantly increases the risk of a deadly outcome when conflict arises. Emotions run high, and the accessibility of a firearm turns moments of panic into permanent decisions. Rashawn may not have intended to kill, but the gun made that possibility all too real. Fear, especially in intimate relationships, is a complicated emotion. It's often rooted in past experiences, trauma, or the weight of being unheard. Whether Rashawn's fear was justified by Damien's behavior or magnified by emotional buildup, it became the lens through which she made a critical decision. And fear, though powerful, can cloud judgment in the most devastating ways. Social media, the spark of this particular dispute, has become a modern battleground for many couples. Misunderstandings over likes, comments, and messages fuel jealousy and distrust, especially when communication is already strained. What might seem like a harmless digital interaction can trigger insecurity or feelings of betrayal, especially if past wounds haven't healed. This case also forces a look at how we teach conflict resolution. Many people aren't equipped to handle high-stakes, emotional conversations. They bottle things up until they explode. They react instead of reflect. And in homes with weapons, that lack of training becomes deadly. Had Rashawn and Damien had access to therapy, mentorship, or even time apart, would the outcome have been different? Mental health also plays a crucial role. Both partners may have been carrying stressors unknown to anyone else. Rashawn, as a nurse, likely faced emotional fatigue from her job. Damien may have had insecurities or frustrations he didn't express. Without mental health check-ins or outlets, those emotional burdens can leak into relationships and shape responses in ways that surprise even the people involved. In cases like this, nuance matters. This wasn't a black and white situation. It was layered with emotional complexity, impulsive fear, and a deeply tragic misjudgment. Understanding that allows us to approach similar stories with empathy and with a sense of responsibility. Because these tragedies aren't always rooted in evil. Sometimes they're rooted in overwhelm. Advocates point to the need for domestic safety education, not just about recognizing abuse, but about managing conflict and creating safe emotional space in relationships. They also emphasize safe firearm storage, de-escalation training, and community resources that can intervene before a crisis turns deadly. If anything good can come from this loss, it's that others may learn from it and live. Ultimately, Rashawn and Damien's story is a heartbreaking example of what happens when communication breaks down, fear takes over, and weapons are within reach. It reminds us that love alone isn't always enough to prevent tragedy, and that support, awareness, and preparation can make all the difference between a conflict and a catastrophe. As of now, Rashawn Wallace remains out on bond, awaiting the legal proceedings that will determine her future. Charged with murder, she faces a justice system that must weigh not only the facts, but the deeply emotional context behind those facts. Her legal team continues to prepare a self-defense case, one they believe reflects the emotional urgency of that morning, an act of fear rather than aggression. But the courtroom is not a place of emotion. It's a place of law, and the outcome remains uncertain. Meanwhile, the family of Damien Reed is still trying to process their loss. They buried a beloved son, a father, and a friend, and now must live with the questions that may never have full answers. Their grief is heavy. Their pain is real. And their hope, perhaps, is that his memory won't be overshadowed by the tragic circumstances of his death, but remembered for the man he was in life. The child caught in the middle of this tragedy now lives without the presence of both parents. That reality will shape their world in countless ways, from the quiet sadness of Father's Day to the confusion of understanding what really happened. It's a heartbreaking reminder of why prevention matters, and why every relationship deserves the space for healthy communication and intervention before it's too late. For the community, the The story of Rashawn and Damien is a call to awareness. Not all conflict looks dangerous until it is. Not all homes with tension show signs to the outside world. We must talk more openly about mental health, emotional regulation, and safe conflict resolution, especially in romantic partnerships. These tools are not luxuries. They are necessities for preventing violence. This tragedy also calls us to reflect on gun safety in domestic spaces. The presence of a firearm doesn't automatically make a home safer. In emotionally volatile moments, it increases the risk of irreversible consequences. Discussions around responsible storage, de-escalation training, and limiting access during mental or emotional distress are more important than ever. If you or someone you know is in a relationship marked by constant tension, control, or fear, whether physical violence is present or not, please seek support. Local shelters, hotlines, and counseling services exist to help navigate difficult dynamics before they become dangerous. You are never alone, and it is never too early to ask for help. And for all of us watching the story unfold, let it be more than news. Let it be a reminder to listen more closely, to speak more gently, and to protect those we love not just from the outside world, but sometimes from ourselves. Healing begins with honesty, and change begins with awareness. This story, like so many others, is not just about a crime. It's about people. Rashawn Wallace and Damien Reed were two individuals trying to make their way through life, love, and the challenges that come with both. What happened between them was devastating. And while no one can undo what's been done, we can honor their story by learning from it, and by holding space for the humanity behind the headlines. As we reflect on what took place, let us remember Damien not only for how he died, but for how he lived, as a father, a partner, a man with hopes and a future. Let us also hold space for Rashawn, who now carries the burden of a choice made in fear and the haunting consequences that followed. Their child, innocent, blameless, deserves our deepest empathy and our commitment to building a world where tragedies like this are less likely to happen. If this story has touched you, made you reflect, or helped you better understand the complexity of domestic situations, we ask that you share it, not for clicks or likes, but because raising awareness matters. When we talk about these things openly, with compassion and care, we create space for real change. We help people recognize red flags. We remind others that they're not alone. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to this channel. Here, we tell real stories with empathy. We dig deeper, not for shock value, but for truth, for the lessons hidden inside painful moments, and for the voices that might otherwise go unheard. Every subscriber helps amplify these stories in a way that honors the people behind them. Your engagement, your likes, your comments, your shares, they don't just support this channel. They support the mission of telling stories that matter, stories that might reach someone in a situation they don't know how to escape, or someone who just needs to feel seen and understood. If you or someone you know is in emotional or physical danger at home, don't wait. Reach out. There are people ready to listen. There are resources out there designed to help before tragedy strikes. You are not alone. It is never too late to choose a different path. We thank you for spending this time with us, for bearing witness to Rashawn and Damien's story. These are not easy conversations, but they are necessary ones. And if by listening, by truly listening, we can help prevent one more heartbreak, then this story has served a purpose beyond pain. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.